This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, let's get started, everyone. All right, here we are. We are in week number 5, I hope, because that's the lecture I prepared. So, we've got a bit to get through here, and I'll remind you right now while I think of it that next week is not a teaching day on Monday, if that helps you keep up with all your different bits of work. So, okay, so tonight we've got the key. In fact, we could never cover anything like the whole area of assessment, but we're going to cover some key areas and some key principles, and we're going to focus in on Res Code for a few reasons. Because because it reveals many of the key things about the planning scheme, but also it is usually something that consumes a lot of people's time, particularly in the early parts of their career. Not always, but it is often the case. So we're going to dig into that. You'll also see in the administration column, I've put their handout, worksheet 3 and 4, so you may have already seen that I've made those available as well. This is under the assumption that you will find your own time to do these things, and that you will do numbers 1 and 2 first, and indeed you will complete your assignment, which is due around the 9th. When is that due? Let me tell you for sure. The 9th of April at 5 p.m. on the Turnitin mechanism there. So if that doesn't work, let me know, but I'm pretty sure it's set up ready to go. So we are looking today at assessment using the planning scheme. I feel like there's a bit of feedback or something going on. Okay, so let's have a look at that. This idea of joining abstract policy to things on the ground. So we've got all this policy, for example, about urban consolidation and communities and amenity. That is feedback, isn't it? I wonder if it's this thing doing it. Put that over there. All right. All kinds of policies. One of the places they touch ground is in... Still not working. Let's try that. It's okay right now. All right, we'll see how that goes. Res Code brings together a lot of the tensions and indeed the potentials of the planning scheme. So it's a great little subset of what the planning scheme does to look at. Before we go into that, I'm going to contextualise that with something of an historic viewpoint. And then we'll go through some examples to get you thinking about, in a very practical way, how policy, a practical set of circumstances and a set of rules bring about a way of thinking about decisions on an individual site. So, in terms of background here, like every place, like every community or city or state, there is a range of dynamic activities going on over time. And in Australia, our trend towards higher density in the cities, and in particular in Melbourne and Sydney, has only really started from the 1960s, in a very slow way, I would add, and has only really taken off in the 1990s. And obviously now in this area in particular, you can see some of the manifestations of that, and indeed you may know Melbourne very well and think of many other places as well. Part of this change over time has been through gentrification, the process of change where richer people came in and paid more money for land that has had added value through redevelopment or renovation occurring. I say that because that is not universally the case. You can go to many developed countries and find shrinking cities where or places where there's white flight or other kinds of middle class leaving of certain areas as well. So this is the Australian version of higher densities. In areas like Parkville, like Carlton, like Fitzroy, South Yarra, you know, I can reel a few of these names out. We had this slow change towards gentrification, and much of that change was driven by professionals, and many of those people were starting to see some of the negatives of long commutes, thinking about alternative lifestyles that weren't necessarily focused around suburbs, and we had this push back from the 60s onwards. And you can see a lot of that in Carlton, just around this area, in fact. And generally speaking, academics are not paid huge amounts, but it's probably higher than average, and I won't complain about my salary, don't worry. You know, it's not a bad. It wasn't a bad trade-off actually for many people to move back into areas like this. It probably also happened at the same time that there was a resurgence in heritage and cultural values, a reassessment of what a good place is like. It's not all about newness, and it's not all about suburban values, but in fact there might be some other things going on. And I suppose, and I've made a particular point there about it, that there was a groundswell of sentiment amongst the built environment professionals against the suburb. So this came out of an intellectual questioning of the suburb in the 1960s, and then by the 1970s quite a strong movement amongst planners, architects, geographers who were really starting to question, is the suburb the only way to go? And it wasn't just problems with sprawl, it was to do with equity and access and lifestyle choice and these kinds of things. And a seminal book was by Hugh Stretton, who was based in ANU at that time and was there at the same time as Pat Troy, who went on to become, and in some ways still is, one of the leading figures in Australian planning. He wrote Ideas for Australian Suburbs, or Ideas for Australian Cities, in which he, and amongst many others, dealt with this trade-off between suburban values and other ways of organising our cities, starting to question low density versus high density, car-based travel, and just what do we expect from our cities. While we had many challenges, on the whole, it was assumed in Australia that suburbs were generally good. They're good to raise children, they gave a great lifestyle, we'd always be able to drive cars, we could build more freeways, and all those associated things. So it's actually a really interesting area, this turning point where low density living was not necessarily seen as a good thing. And we started to feel, and it probably was more the case in Sydney, that, hey, there might not be an unlimited supply of land to keep expanding outwards, because the foothills of Sydney made us aware of that containment a little bit earlier than Melbourne, where we've got lots of flat land out there, where I suppose, you know, back at that time it was just assumed we'd keep going outwards. So slowly there was, I probably shouldn't even use the word consensus, but perhaps a consensus amongst certain groups in the built environment professions that we needed, at least in some small way, to have higher densities as part of the mix of housing. So there was a relative acceptance that yes, offices might go in high rise, and you know, there might be big department stores and limited amounts of social housing in high rise, but this idea that people who might actually choose to live in high rise was a relatively new idea at this time. And a few other things started to happen such as the Strata Titles Act 1967. Prior to that time, you could only own land in X and Y. There was not a 3D. So the Strata Titles Act meant you could own a package in 3 dimensions. It might be up in the air. I suppose it could be down under the ground. It could be a basement car park that you owned as well. So this actually has occurred at very different times in different countries, and largely was associated with this need to build at higher density for residential purposes. Prior to that, there were the Bodies Corporate Act allowed people to own a part of a site, so they could own an apartment or a flat. But the Strata Titles Act formalised the process and let you own it and have a certificate of title that described a piece of land up in the air. Whether or not, a piece of land, a property up in the air, whether or not it was even constructed, because you can buy off the plan. So some sort of slightly tricky things emerged out of that. But on the whole, this facilitated and made possible that people would buy apartments much more readily and have ownership rights and take out a mortgage on it and all those other things. It made it much simpler to do. At the same time, Australia has enjoyed, well, I probably shouldn't use the word enjoyed because now all the bad effects are coming out of that, but we've had sustained prosperity for a very, very long time. Of course, there have been some ups and downs, but pretty much since the Second World War, there's been steady prosperity, economic stability. That sound in the background. If you can't hear me, let me know and I'll try other settings, but that background noise is bothering me. Let's see if this has got something to do with it. I can't tell how to switch it off. Sorry guys. Off. Okay, see if that helps. So we've had this increasing land prices. We reached a tipping point in about the 1990s where it became viable from a development and property sales perspective to build higher density residential. And if you're familiar with the property concept of the bid rent curve, just the way that values generally decrease as you move out. So that coincided with just how much money a developer could make out of building at higher densities for residential purposes on the whole. So, it became much more lucrative to build at higher densities. The fuel crisis around 72, 73 made it very apparent to the general public, let alone politicians and planners, that maybe the car is not always going to be the answer. Of course, the OPEC and all of these players in the fuel game have kept us going in some ways, but it started to make some changes there. Demographic changes, a lot of those are attributable to contraception and different expectations of professional and other couples to have fewer children, and then that gradually made its way into the general population, people becoming more educated, people moving into knowledge economies, different roles for men and women and expectations of family. And then this whole change that occurred in the mid-1970s under the Department of Urban and Regional Development at national level. So this was under the Whitlam government, a Labor government and a very, very progressive government. And Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was seen as a hero, a guru, a leading light by many people who were more progressive, and was seen as a socialist and a command and control planner and a troublemaker by many people on the right. So quite a divisive figure. But during a period of about 5 years, that urban planning came very prominently onto the national agenda. Pretty much the first time it had happened, except for a couple of notable exceptions, such as the housing policies that were introduced after the Second World War. with people coming home from the war and setting up families and needing housing. There haven't been many examples where housing was on the national agenda until the 70s, and it made planning seem important. There was a need to address these big problems that were emerging and the start of inequities. We'd fooled ourselves up until this time that we were a fair nation, that continuous suburban growth would work, everyone has a fair go, everyone should buy a house in the suburbs. This was a time when it started to be perhaps acknowledged that maybe it's not all working exactly how we wanted, and this DIRD agency, unfortunate name really, isn't it, but it came into the consciousness that actually we might need to start planning in slightly different ways. And at the same time, we had a lot of cultural change in Australia. Different people living here, with immigration policy changing, and just the way we lived as Australians. So if we track forward a little bit more, and I'll just sort of maybe make a few more comments about national planning. On the whole, it is correct to say we don't have urban planning at a national level in Australia. The projects during the 70s that were introduced were largely funding projects for infrastructure and seeking to deal with housing and demonstration schemes. One of the challenges we have in Australia is that, the Constitution prevents national government from doing a lot of things, and one of them is direct planning. It's given over to the states. But the federal government can introduce a lot of policies and funding schemes that actually have huge implications at the state level for planning, one of which you've probably seen in the news lately has been immigration policy. So the states don't exactly have a say in that, but they've got to deal with all the people who come, whatever you think about that debate. The Reserve Bank and the setting of interest rates, the giving of loans, whether there are schemes such as negative gearing, which essentially encourages people who have bought one house to buy more, and it becomes almost easier and easier for them to buy more. The idea originally was to have more rental properties available, but what has happened is that it's forcing prices up. So this is a national policy. It's not really a planning policy, but it has a lot to do with outcomes in a given place, state by state and city by city. The other one would be first home owners grant schemes, which again sound great, will help young people and first home buyers into the market, but anyone who's done basic economics know that as soon as you modify the market like that, it just pushes prices up. It's sort of like, what are they thinking? But it sounds good politically. So while we don't have a national planning agency, although we've got Infrastructure Australia, obviously the clue's in the name, what they do, we do have a lot of policy going on that has impacts. So, drill down a bit more, as the pressures came on, particularly in the 1990s, there was a realisation that there needed to be specific policy that dealt with housing at higher densities. Back in the 1990s, subdividing a quarter-acre block into two and building two houses was, pretty serious stuff, and people were pretty excited about that in various ways. Nowadays, we think that's nothing. You should see what's happening next to me with medium, high, and high-rise redevelopment. But this is just the way planning works, and the tensions that come out. It's dealing between the politics and the cultural expectations and the technical matters that planners and indeed others are faced with. So a few changes occurred over time. We had Vic Code number 1, was largely about subdivision. Subdivision is obviously very important because as soon as you divide up land, whether it's for more lots or including the road reserves, that's like the urban DNA underneath, isn't it? That starts shaping where the services go, how many houses could be built there on land, the nature of that housing, where sun paths go, all of that sort of background stuff. And Vic Code 2, which came along a little bit after, dealt with medium density housing. So medium density was roughly understood as housing on lots of less than 500 square metres, or more than one house on a lot of 500 square metres or under 300 square metres, depending which municipality you were in. So by international standards, probably not medium density. By Australian standards, yes, for that time. Nowadays, the lot's being built on the edge of the city. Anyone have a guess? Does anyone know what a quarter acre block is? How big is a quarter acre? We don't use acres anymore, but you still hear it. Yeah, 1,012 square metres. Yeah, slightly less, so bang on, yeah. So that's a quarter acre. In fact, the Great Australian Dream of a quarter acre, actually not that many blocks were a quarter of an acre ever, except in country areas. There were some places that had it because they didn't have sewerage, and depending on the soil type, about 1,000 square metres, quarter of an acre, because that was an even number in those times. So 1,012 square metres was quite a good size to have a septic system. As in, you know, you get the little bacteria and stuff working away there often in a sandy soil system, and you don't need to connect everything up to sewerage. So that's, most people would say that's probably where the quarter acre block thing came from. And another example of how we've done a lot of stuff kind of on the cheap, done it the easy way in Australian cities in the early days with lots of land and space, etc. And it fit in with a lot of other expectations about large lots and people growing fruit trees and these sorts of things. So medium density housing guide was brought in, and the big thing that it did that was different was that it said, when we build at higher densities, a new set of problems emerge, often around urban character and amenity. Amenity for the new housing and amenity for the existing housing. So the medium density housing guide and the later ones that came through, such as the Good Design Guide and now what we call Res Code, are oriented to mediating and dealing with the impacts of change as we increase density, often around amenity, and then a range of other concerns such as car parking, overshadowing, streetscape, etc. And so there's a lot of crossover between amenity and other things in this. So I've probably said all this before. So medium density housing, it's coinciding with higher property values, changing attitudes, big profits for developers. It was the birth of a whole new industry in the planning sector, the property sector, building. All of a sudden local government had a whole lot more work to do. So a lot of change occurred through this modification of the ways that we would live in housing in Australian cities. The other thing that it brought was neighbours arguing with the council, with each other, with developers around this stuff. Because one of the other things that became very strong internationally, and particularly in Western liberal democracies, with academics and just with practice, was the need to have third-party rights. And third-party rights are not the applicant or the developer, and not council, but the community or individual citizens having a say. So this had been knocking around in academic circles since the 60s in some ways. 70s it gathered pace, and 80s, but in the 1990s it was it was well and truly within our act and with the consciousness. So a lot of contentious things have happened around Australia in planning to do what this sort of intersection of things going on at once, including citizen participation processes. So alongside the technical stuff, planners are dealing with the public and politicians and other agencies that are required to be brought together through something like the planning scheme using the Good Design Guide, or what we call now ResCode. One of the things that happened with ResCode was that this almost perfect storm of higher land values and a huge push for redevelopment of existing land from the mid-90s was when it really started pushing on, was that activist groups such as Save Our Suburbs, and that's probably the most famous one, but there are many other ones, and some of them are, oh, I can see it there on the stairs. Many other groups popped up. Some of them were transient, others, you know, have lived on, and Save Our Suburbs and key figures from Save Our Suburbs that started in the 90s are still there, still, you know, fighting the fight to stop change that they believe is inappropriate. But one of the things that happened is that the Good Design Guide became almost like the manifesto for evil for those groups. And it was a separate document. It was referred to in the planning scheme, but you could hold it up and wave it around, and it had a big revision, and not much changed. It was called a big revision. It looked a bit different, but actually the controls were pretty similar. Then it had another big revision, and it became ResCode. But I would argue the biggest change that occurred is that it was no longer a separate document. And it was actually devious and wonderful at the same time how it kind of took the heat off ResCode. It was kind of interesting. So nowadays you can barely tell it's a separate, well, it's not really a separate document anymore because it's in the planning scheme. People in the planning game call it ResCode, but actually you don't even need to know that. You just need to know that it's clause 54, 55 and 56. So it's quite an interesting process. It also is testament to the fact that so much of planners' energy is spent on dealing with medium density housing now in ways that were never anticipated previously because it was just little incremental changes previously. So, ResCode. Let's start thinking about this in a statutory sense. In very broad terms, it applies in cases where it's the construction of or extension or changes to dwellings at higher densities, not ultra high density, and for residential subdivision. So just recalling that subdivision is about changing lot boundaries, and development is about building the actual structures. So if we think about how land is built upon, so we've got, oh, I can't stand using chalk. Let's see how we go. We've got a road. And we've got some lots there, and let's say they might be 1,000 and quarter acre, and they're going to be subdivided, and the developer wants to do something like this, where there's a okay, and they subdivide it. Say these, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You know, these are about 150 square metres each, give or take. Would you want to let someone subdivide that without really knowing what's going on there? You don't know necessarily whether it's possible to build new dwellings on that land. It's a very common thing developers try to do. You know, entrance and egress there, whole bunch of blocks. Oh, that's the front door now. Off we go. Generally speaking, it would be a pretty bad idea to make small residential lots without finding out whether or not you can even build on that land in terms of good design outcomes, good amenity, making sure it's safe, and, you know, all of those sort of questions. So what ResCode, and indeed Good Design Guide before it, requires is that you first apply for the structures, the design, and then you apply for subdivision afterwards. So you're applying for development and possibly use first, and then the subdivision afterwards, the actual division of land in X and Y and indeed Z, potentially, comes along later as a routine process, because all of the design issues are dealt with at the start with the application for permit for development. So, you know, you can then work out, the driveway's wide enough for cars, someone won't have their front, their bedroom windows right next to a driveway where cars are running up and down a ramp and there's vibration. There won't be overlooking. All that is dealt with first before subdivision, because once land is subdivided, it's a big deal to change it. People own it, they expect to be able to use it, etc. So one of the things about Res Code is that it deals with land that is relatively small. On these big lots, say that's 1,012 square metres, you don't need a planning permit, assuming the zone allows it. If it's residentially zoned, on a big lot you generally don't need a planning permit to build a house. So, no, it's big, you'll get amenity kind of without having to try too hard, assuming it meets the building code. So the building code has some basic siting requirements, and then knock yourself out, do whatever you like. So this was the old idea of the suburbs on large lots in Australia. You kind of got amenity for free just because there was heaps of space and you do what you wanted. Things were separated. So this, if that doesn't make complete sense, it'll come out as we keep talking. So it's all about residential amenity, neighbourhood character, how we deal with density in some of the technical issues, and environmental goals. And I suppose the background of this is that the planning scheme encourages development. We want development. It's part of our kind of background assumptions with all of this. So specifically, Res Code, and when you read down a zone and you look if there's an application for dwelling, you read down through the zone controls and it will actually require that it is assessed against clause 55 or 56, which is Res Code. So you need to make sure by the end of this lecture series you can sort of knit all that together. We'll make it easy for you. So it applies if it's residentially zoned, and if the land is usually it's less than 300 square metres, thinking of this argument I made here, and if there's 2 or more dwellings on one lot. So if we're putting 2 structures here, we want to know, well, how will they interact? Because we expect that it is highly likely whoever's built that will want to subdivide it. So we want to know how that will work. Some authorities wanted to invoke a Res Code assessment at 500 square metres. That can be for a range of reasons, often to try and stop inappropriate development was one of the big drivers there, but also it could just be that their subdivision pattern is such that lots of things were 350 square metres and it meant they weren't getting picked up. So there could be a few reasons for that. And you'll see that in a schedule of the zone. It will invoke a different lot size as a trigger for Res Code. And indeed for any residential subdivision. Okay, so I do not know how to fix that feedback. Maybe it's because I'm speaking too loudly. Okay, so what you need to do, just reminding ourselves of what a statutory planning approach would be. What do? We go looking for where the triggers are. The trigger for permit and the criteria against which something is measured or compared. So we always are looking for that in the planning scheme. Why does it need a permit? Sometimes you find it doesn't need a permit. So when I was in practice, often I'd get clients ringing up and saying, oh, I need a planning permit. Can you help me? How much do you cost? You know, all that stuff. And I'd say, well, before we get into writing down contracts and stuff, what's the zone and how big's your land? And often people have a lovely surprise when they find out they don't even need a planning permit. or they don't need a res code assessment, depending on what they're trying to do. So I've just ripped these straight out of the planning scheme, and you'll see here clause 54 for one dwelling on a lot, clause 55, 2 or more dwellings on a lot, and clause 56, residential subdivision. Generally speaking, this residential subdivision is for the kinds of things that happen on the edge of the city, you know, on new land. Think of that. That's the kind of the main purpose of those. And because it talks about street layouts and these sorts of things. Okay, so the zones and indeed in the clauses are the triggers for assessment against res code. So here's something for you to investigate. What if res code is not triggered on large lots? Actually go and look at the different zones. Be very, very useful for you. Work your way through and find out where or where not there is a trigger for res code to be used. It's a good practice, a good skill, not just for res code, actually for any trigger. But here I've mentioned this very briefly. Any structure, including a dwelling, there are some exemptions, but pretty much every single structure requires a building permit. So a building permit is under the Building Act. There's a national building code. The states can have little variations, but on the whole, it's a national code for building in Australia. It has its own processes, and every single structure, including decks and gazebos and things like that, and you know, other outbuildings of any size, requires a building permit. And on the whole, it's about human safety. So has it got sewage connections and water? Has it got sufficient windows? Has it got structural integrity? It won't fall down. Are there balustrades? You know, all of these kinds of things. So that actually probably doesn't comply with the building code built before it. So, you know, there's a lot of things about safety and health and those sorts of things are picked up by the building code. The planning system has a particular view. On the whole, we assume if we make our permits, it's up to, you know, so we do a planning assessment based on what's in the planning scheme. On the whole, we assume that a developer or an architect or a builder or even, you know, a mum and dad developer deal with the building permit separately after they get a planning permit. And I guess it's a kind of a bureaucratic viewpoint, but also we can't think of everything all the time. We tend to deliberately not take into account things that should be dealt with in another process under a different act. There are exceptions to that. An area I work in a lot is bushfire, and the planning scheme sort of incorporates one of the bushfire codes under the Building Act within it, but that's relatively unusual. So if there is no requirement for a res code assessment, some very basic things about siting and vehicle access are dealt with under the building code. But as I said, on these large lots, there's no need for a building permit. So these are common. I hope you can read that. That seems to have gotten a bit greyed out there. But if you're changing a structure, it needs a building permit. They're all kind of obvious. Structural alterations. I'd have to say it's actually very common that people don't get a building permit for things. And, you know, yeah, let's have a doorway. I think all these home renovation shows aren't really helping. Let's put a big doorway through there. Oh God, why is the roof falling in? So, you know, it is a bit of a problem, compliance. Carports, some fences, usually high fences that are made out of brick and things like that, over 2 metres. Masts, antennas, all kinds of stuff. So, just thinking mainly this is about safety and health matters with building. Okay, and you should, if you need to, go and look at it, but you probably just need to know that it exists. There are some basic controls in the Building Act about siting. that essentially mean that people don't jam themselves right up against the boundary or make it impossible to have proper access and things like this. So I'll let you read that under your own steam. So clause 54 is one dwelling on a lot, and generally speaking, it's on a small lot of less than 300 square metres where this would be invoked in a residential zone or a trigger for this assessment. So you can imagine, you know, it's entirely possible to build a dwelling on 100 square metres, but, you know, it does invoke a level of design care and innovation often, particularly on existing lots where there might be all kinds of tricky layouts. So really this is saying, all right, we want to know that it all works. We don't want the detailed building and structural stuff, we just want to know entrances and exits and overshadowing and these sorts of things, and that it fits in with neighbourhood character. So clause 54 there is dealing with one dwelling on a small lot. On the whole, it's exactly the same as clause 55. So I won't go through both, but clause 55 is where we deal with two or more dwellings on a single lot that will subsequently be subdivided. Before I go into that, should we have a little break right now, because I think this is an opportune time before I run through a fairly lengthy piece on that. So if we come back at 6:05, I do have a fair bit to cover. So quick break and then we'll push through to the end. It's probably a sort of convenient time. Cheers, guys. Okay, so just thought that was a good time to have a little break. So we're going to look in a bit more detail. We won't go through absolutely everything because it would take a bit too long, but let's think about Res Code, and in particular clause 55. This is bread and butter work for urban planners in development control settings. It's, as I said before, it's probably the most common place where planners in their early years work, amongst other things. And so let's have a look at some of the key components of clause 55, and I would encourage you to follow through on these over the coming weeks to feel like you know them, because once you get the skills of looking at clause 55, you'll find this way of thinking is quite translatable to other parts of the planning scheme. So I'll mention that as I go through tonight. So as with many of the clauses, a purpose is stated at the beginning, and it sets out this higher order direction that the tests that are to be applied in detail sit under. And so you'll see here it's meant to achieve the SPPF, local policy, MSS, to achieve residential development. See here, you'll see already, you can see an assumption that it's all about development, as long as it respects existing character and contributes to preferred neighbourhood character, to encourage residential development that provides reasonable amenity for existing and new people, and to encourage residential development that is responsive to the site and the neighbourhood. So what you find underneath that is a series of tests that are applied. And when I use the word test, I mean that in a fairly specific way, insofar as the proposal is measured against these tests, against these criteria. And one of the characteristics of Res Code is that it doesn't have a predetermined design outcome set out in advance, but it's a series of performance tests that are imposed. So some planning schemes have a fairly formulaic answer that tends to result from their use. And I suppose ResCode does a little bit, but it also tries to allow a level of innovation to occur, so site responsiveness is one of the key outcomes. I'll leave you to decide yourselves whether or not it really achieves that. But one of the key things that is quite a transferable understanding here is to understand the operations of ResCode. And it has three main elements to the way that we apply ResCode. For each of the tests or each of the provisions, there's usually three elements. The first one is objectives. What is this element of ResCode setting out to achieve? And you'll see lots of examples as we go through, but it might be to respect a neighbourhood amenity or neighbourhood character, etc. And then it has a standard which tells you how usually you can achieve that objective. However, there is provision to not necessarily meet that predetermined standard if you have an innovative way of dealing with it, or perhaps you have a particularly challenging site and it can't be met, but you make up for it in other ways. So it's trying to allow a component of flexibility and indeed innovation in the design response. And then it sets out decision guidelines. So what are the things that must be considered to help you decide, does it meet the objectives that are stated at the front, at the start? So really, it's encouraging innovation, and it's saying that as long as you meet the objectives, you will probably get a permit for that. It's easier said than done because there's a lot of complexity in these, and in some ways there might be a balancing off of different objectives and standards and design guidelines. But you'll see written in ResCode, a development must meet all of the objectives, and it should meet all of the standards. So at some point there is often a need for professional judgment to understand that there might be innovation, and on balance, have we met the objectives? So this is why we don't get a machine or a robot or whatever to do it, but rather there needs to be professional consideration and expertise applied to it. So the first one is this requirement for a neighbourhood and site description in conjunction with, in parallel with, a design response. And that is there, and that hasn't always been there. That was only introduced in maybe about 1999 or 2000 or so, where it's more of a design approach, saying here's what's happening in this place. And you'll notice that I've asked you to do something rather like this for assignment 1, which I hope that you're on top of. And that understanding of what's happening in a place is occurring before we suddenly come to a conclusion as the design response, to try and take us down a path of having site-responsive proposals put forward for consideration. And the design response is very important. It must demonstrate how the proposed development is a logical progression from understanding a place and how you respond to that. These are drawing-based with written descriptions to augment them. So I've been using this example for a while, but it does the job quite well. And it's just one example. I just am showing a bit of it so that I can fit it onto the screen reasonably. So I've chopped off the edges, but I think you'll get the idea. Here is the site. It's been set out with a heavier line showing the edges. You'll notice that it's 2 lots that are right next together, and I was speaking to a lady earlier who asked me some questions. Here's an example where a developer has acquired 2 sites together, which provides for the ability to have a little bit more scope to come up with a design response and to maximise the use of the land. This is becoming more and more common in Melbourne because if you just have a small lot, there's just only so much you can do. So you start to get economies from consolidating lots. You'll also see on here that we have the footprints of the existing buildings, the garage, where the main trees are, the main entrances. It's probably a bit hard for you to see, but you know, where cars come in and go out. But you'll also see the footprints of the structures in proximity to that application site. And I haven't included them here, but associated with these numbers is a little description of what is over in that direction, you know, what are the general characteristics and so forth. So just by seeing that drawing, it's essentially making an argument. And this is why we need to take drawings very seriously and make sure that they're accurate, because the developer here and his evil consultant, that was me, we're starting to build up an argument here. I'm not saying we did anything wrong, but we're making an argument that in this context there are certain characteristics that are important to take into consideration. And so, you know, what are the land uses around? There's a small park, there's tennis courts, there's large street trees, and so on and so forth. And the design response, this was considered at the time a fairly almost aggressive response to use most of the site and to build on it fairly intensively. Since this time it's become much more common, but we felt that it was appropriate to respond by building over most of the land there. There weren't any significant trees or other impediments to doing that, and that in the surrounding area, so this is the streetscape, and this is the site from here to here, and so that's the elevation. And we made the argument that, well, actually, if you look in the streetscape, we've got a lot of large housing blocks. They have large footprints. They're 3 stories on the whole. They present a rather bulky appearance in the streetscape, and that in fact it would be appropriate to build something of this general size because it generally fits in with the existing streetscape. Now, not everyone agreed with this. Council did, I would add, because people often oppose change. But just at this very broad scale, it's starting to build an argument and explain a design response-based rationale without even going into the little details of what the proposal is. And yeah, so does that make a general sense, that site context and response? Because it's a fundamental way of thinking about development most of the time. Silence is assent, I'll go with that. Okay, so assuming that council accepts that, then we have clause 5502, and you can see here it has a number of sub-tests underneath it, but primarily these are about what is the existing character of the place and is there sufficient infrastructure to support the proposal. So there's a range of tests for neighbourhood character. You can imagine what they would be. Dwelling height or structures height, spaces between the building or buildings built to the lot boundary, garden character, roof style, window style, and so on and so forth. There can be huge diversity in these things. And then council might have its own policy dealing with local character in that area. They might have done a study, etc. How diverse the dwellings are. So if you go into an area where there's huge homogeneity in that area, you might have to make an argument. If you wanted to build something quite different, you'd have to have a pretty good reason to build something that had a different architectural style. And maybe that'd be okay, or maybe they say, no, it's in a heritage overlay as well. We want something that fits in with this, in these key characteristics. And then infrastructure, just can you support it? The road system, the stormwater system, the sewerage system. Is it possible to support this in this place? And then when those higher level characteristics are dealt with, what are some of the other factors that are part of this? I'm sorry about that ringing. I don't know what to do. I'll persevere. So B5 is integration with the street. In the early days of building at medium density, there was very little design responsiveness and very little limited design skills amongst developers and indeed builders who were doing this rather insensitively. So you'll see here that some of these new structures, we wouldn't be approving those nowadays because they don't really address the street or integrate with the street in any kind of sensitive way. It's rather stark to just have garage doors directly at the streetscape, to ignore the fact that these heritage structures over here have windows and doors and a porch at the front which sort of encourages a human interaction. Rather, if you had a street like that, imagine the whole street like that, it would be very unwelcoming, and in fact it would probably not get over the line in terms of security either. So one of the other things that we need to think about in a development control setting is, sure, could we put up with just one of those in the street? Well, but actually, how is a city built? It's built individual site by individual site. So we do have to kind of hold a line and say, actually, every single site must be of a sufficient standard. Because if you let things like this through, you are encouraging a lack of focus on the big picture of how a city changes over time. Because the city we have now is a series of incremental changes. So we have to be kind of tough sometimes to say, no, not good enough, you cannot build it. So as I said, this was built prior to a more sensitive res code approach. And is this really acceptable? You've got a big long fence, you can't see the entrance, you've got a garage door. It's not a particularly sensitive approach. This probably has some problems with the pastiche kind of design, but you can see that it's a residential structure. I probably didn't take the best photo there, but you can see the front entrance. You can tell it's a dwelling. So, and so on and so forth. And this is in some ways where design meets urban planning in this statutory setting. And I could show you hundreds of photos to talk it through, but the main thing is just to understand that we do have an expectation that dwellings in particular do integrate with the street in a human way, in some way. And then we talk about site layout and building massing. Mass is just how big and bulky something feels. And one component of that is B6, which is street setback. And this is just a little excerpt from that. And a very common scenario is you've got, one lot has a house here, another lot has a house here. How far are they set back from the front street boundary? So when we say setback, I'll have to use chalk again. We're talking about, let's make it simple, what is this distance here? And this might be, the nature strip and the sidewalk, but the setback is from the property boundary to the front face of the structure. Obviously, sometimes the structure might have more than one face. We're generally talking about the closest one when we talk about this. So if the one next door, if these both had huge setbacks, it could well be said that bringing something so close forward might not be in keeping with the existing streetscape design. So this is just one element, but it is often quite contentious because in some established areas, a big setback is associated with gardens and, you know, all kinds of things. It's a big part of neighbourhood character. So if you go up to North Balwyn or somewhere, you know, it can be a really big deal. It can be one of the big impediments to being able to build at higher density, because lots of big front gardens as a key part of that urban character. So, so you'll see, what's the test here? The average distance of the setbacks of the front walls of the existing buildings on the abutting allotments, or 9 metres. So you average those out, or if they're absolutely way back, you're allowed to build up to 9 metres, because there has to be a stopping point to that. So basically they're just trying to make it fit in within limits. Does that make rough sense? So what the Good Design Guide and now the Res Code is trying to do is to break down amenity and streetscape and impacts into some measurable components that we can make decisions on, or some that have performance standards for it to meet. So just, you know, an example. You know, 6 metres, 8 metres, averages out to 7, and so on and so forth. Or if you've got nothing, you know, 9 metres. Building height. This again is hugely contentious. It has a lot to do with streetscape. Often local residents, you know, thinking that we are largely mapping transitions from low density to much higher density in Melbourne as we try and achieve state planning policy goals and Plan Melbourne goals. Building height is a big issue, and generally speaking, it's about mediating the interactions between older low-rise with higher-rise structure, whether it's medium density or high-rise. And one of the principles is that if it's being assessed under Res Code or even other things, a general design standard is to try and graduate the change so it's not abrupt. One of the challenges of that is it can often invoke a fairly dodgy design response when you look at the individual structure. It's got all ziggurats and steps, and sometimes it looks pretty dodgy just to achieve that standard. Other times it's designed quite well. But generally speaking, 9 metres is the maximum height, except if you then invoke going to high rise. And, you know, some fairly brutal ones. In fact, I can find plenty of other ones, but this sort of doesn't look quite so nice. I better keep moving. And then we have site coverage. Now, this is a really tricky one. It's here for 2 reasons. One is to try and encourage space for landscaping, and the other is to increase or to maintain sufficient permeability, meaning in this case for rain and stormwater to go into the ground, to try and maintain some semblance of natural water systems in the city, although of course we recognise we've changed it considerably by building urban structures on the land, but to try and reduce these kinds of concrete areas, because the impacts on the stormwater system and indeed on urban flooding are absolutely profound. Remembering that much of our infrastructure, does that help? No, it's just doing it for its own reasons. That much of our infrastructure was designed on the basis of the city being suburban, with lots of gardens around the structures. So when we start, this is on the side of a 1950s apartment block, and they simply concreted the whole thing to make life easy, in one sense of easy. We try to say that the maximum site coverage is 60%, but I'd have to say it is very common for that not to be met, because some of the other goals of the planning system are to maximise land, and that's a bit of a problem. And some areas now in Melbourne really do have urban flooding issues directly because of this. And of course there are lots of associated amenity and garden issues out of this as well. So you can see how that site coverage and permeability, those two tests kind of interact. Yeah, we were right on the boundary of that, because you actually get quite a few square metres around a perimeter of a site. Yeah, it's kind of surprising. Not really usable like a garden though. So I didn't break the rules, no. Or my client. We pushed it, I will say. Energy efficiency. Now there are a range of star rating tests, of course, that need to be applied. But we're trying to think in a detailed design way. And this generally is easier on larger sites with more dwellings and where subdivision boundaries are being modified, and they're often more difficult on existing sites with existing subdivision layouts to deal with. This is one of those things that the star rating, provides a numeric test, but then as well as that, and this is the bit that's not usually done very well, is thinking about if we're re-subdividing, are we trying to make sure that light comes in, so in winter they get light without turning lights on, that clothes drying, clothes hanging areas are going to have sunlight on them for most of the day, for most of the year, that sea breezes might come through so people don't have to click the air conditioner on as much, and so forth. So these are very site-specific things that need to be applied as well. Generally speaking, the subdivision level is where the most opportunities are, rather than, you think some tiny little site on the CBD edge, it's pretty hard to achieve that stuff. B11 asks us to consider whether a new development will have an impact on open space. And you'll see that I'm not going into all of these in great detail, but just so you know that it exists. Sometimes you will see a developer is trying to maximise the use of the land. They provide some open space, but it's just awful. It's hard to imagine anyone using a bit of concrete that is constantly in shade, that is noisy because it's next to a road or some air conditioning plant. So that's a big one. B12, safety. When we create new places, we try to make sure that they're safe, and in this sense, safety is not building code safety, as in people tripping over things, but rather personal security safety. So you might have seen a lot of the old, what we used to call six-pack apartments built in the 1960s and 70s, and they commonly were just big rectangular boxes with car parking under them, and usually their safety, their design safety was absolutely terrible, because there's lots of places, for the bad guys to hide behind, for people to get mugged, bad lighting, lots of little entrapment points, etc. So what we try to do is to design that stuff out of the equation at the get-go. So there aren't little places for people to hide, that would be in shade constantly at night, where street lights don't penetrate, all of those sorts of concerns. Again, these are often quite specific to the individual place and the individual design of thinking about that, but there are lots of guides out there that talk about improving safety on private land and indeed in public land. And often there are lots of places like this, where private property interacts with the street. And that's the sort of thing we try and avoid. Plus, rubbish gets blown in there and all that sort of stuff. Landscaping. This is a very tricky area, but what is generally required is an understanding of how the landscaping that is proposed would fit in with neighbourhood character, would suit the development, is likely to encourage the longevity of the planting that is encouraged, and that it would facilitate the proper use of the land and buildings. Normally we do that by having conditions on the planning permit that require a landscaping plan. So there might be a separate diagram and planting guide for where certain species are planted, and even including sometimes how they're going to be watered and those sorts of things. The trouble with plants, of course, is that they don't always survive or thrive in the way that is anticipated. Theoretically, it is enforceable if it is part of the planning permit to say that tree died, you need to replace it and look after it appropriately. Or if someone chops the tree down after it grows big because they didn't like it, someone else lives there 10 years later, theoretically it is enforceable on the planning permit to make them reinstate the landscaping that has been approved. But how often do you think that happens? It's fairly rare. It's only really invoked when there's a dispute between different parties, for example. And the classic one is when, it might be these are meant to grow up into big trees here or something. Could be, the person who lives there, objected to the proposal in the first place, the tree grows big and it looks lovely, and then someone chops it down 10 years later. Maybe they say, oi, I know that was on a condition of permit, on the landscaping plan. But the town planners, unless someone raises it, the town planners aren't cruising around checking all this. It would simply be impossible. So there's a lot of contentious stuff about landscaping, and indeed that making landscaping fit in with aesthetics of the past is not necessarily the case anyway. But obviously this has a lot of impacts on how people perceive the street. It can sometimes have safety and aesthetics impacts. It might even cause problems with the next door neighbours being overshadowed in ways that weren't anticipated. But also, just knowing that a place will actually achieve the functions like private open space. Is it going to be usable private open space? Then we've got a suite of things about parking. And parking is a surprisingly big deal in the planning scheme. There's a lot of assumptions about parking in our planning schemes. Generally speaking, the planning scheme is encouraging the provision of more parking, or a minimum standard of parking. Over time, expectations and understandings about parking are slowly changing. And indeed, in some areas of transport planning, people are saying, and I was one of the ones saying it about 15 years ago, if you want people to use public transport, stop giving them car spaces. That's not a very popular thing to say, and I applied for funding for about 5 years straight on that and had the most vicious critiques of my proposals I've ever received in my life. Like, are you insane? There's already not enough car parking, So, this is something that's very context specific, of course. And indeed, human nature dictates that, I just want to duck down the shops and grab some takeaway or something. Wouldn't it just be easier if there was a car space there? And so, it feeds into a lot of other aspects of how people use the city and our expectations of transport and all that stuff. But Res Code, generally speaking, encourages car parking, and usually 1 or 2 spaces per dwelling, and it encourages the provision of that car parking on the land, but then it allows some other provisions on nearby land, including the street. So this is slowly changing, but it still stipulates a ratio on large developments of 1.5 car spaces per dwelling on average. So that's a particular set of assumptions. This is an old style development. You could almost call that one of the six-pack styles of yesteryear. This was so common and so terrible in terms of a design outcome, because it meant that the only open space was used by cars. Cars would rumble up and down directly outside living rooms and bedrooms. children would play out here with cars going past, generally low speeds, but still, not the most ideal situation. And indeed, what does that do to your streetscape? You've got road here, you've got private road here. So we try to avoid that nowadays. But there are lots of, in a sense, there are lots of things we would try to avoid with car parking. It's not just the number of car spaces, but what it does to the streetscape. So, sometimes it creates this big gaping hole in the middle of the development. There's a whole lot of trade-offs here, aren't there? It's not the most beautiful aesthetic necessarily. This is probably slightly accentuated because one of the other challenges in flood-prone areas is that basement car parks fill up with water, which is incredibly expensive, not just because there's cars down there, but depending on the quality of the water or the design, it might actually wreck the structure or any plant down there. So this one is in Elwood, which is in a special building overlay for flood, and they set that at the 1 in 100 year flood level, that particular height there. But it means that a huge amount of the streetscape is concrete. There's big gaping holes sort of thing. So generally speaking, we try and tuck them around the corner. It wasn't possible on that site. But just think when we aggregate, when we add up all of this concrete here, that equals over a third of the nature strip is gone towards car parking as well. So there's not just one set of tests kind of being applied here. So generally speaking, we try to avoid that, but hard to do. These are luxury, 2 car spaces per dwelling, I think even 3 for some of them. Here is an absolutely awful development. They wrongly received a permit for this. Normally speaking, we would not be allowing the primary access to a dwelling to be between 2 cars. It's ugly, unsafe and non-Disability Act compliant, because you don't know that someone can get their wheelchair down there necessarily. So it's got all kinds of problems. It's a terrible aesthetic. I mean, think of that, think of frail old grandma coming out there, walking around that corner, trying to squeeze herself beside a car. It's crazy. And we laugh, but think of, it's awful. So that's non-compliant. But I sort of show that to remind us how the human use of things is really important, and cars actually can really modify those things. The other thing is just how cars work. This is only 4 metres. I think there are something like 15 dwellings up in here. This was a retrofit that was pretty bad actually. I was asked to look at it and was kind of horrified. But this 4 metres, and there are cars going, in here and out of here. Why would 4 metres wide be an issue? Car breaks down, you can't get out, yeah. I guess, sort of one step back from that is one car comes down, someone's got to reverse back, so 2 cars can't go through at the same time. What you can't see here, there's about 30 metres behind that of a similar width. So hugely inconvenient. And, I sat there for a while on a Friday afternoon, as people were starting to come home from work and go out for dinner, and there was just mayhem again and again and again. So whatever you think of cars, not an ideal situation. Plus, when I was there earlier in the day, this guy decided to wash his car there. Because it's the only place on site he could stop. And so he was constantly moving it. So, but these sort of practical issues, how would people likely use it, is a very important question. What does car parking do to the streetscape? Now, some of you might know this development. It was an urban village design, Lynch's Bridge, and it was meant to be revolutionary. And if I showed you around the corner, I didn't, but if I showed you around the corner, you'd see they have a lovely green and a square, and it's got no cars. Good, but then just behind that, and in fact all around the development, is the knock-on effect of trying to not have cars around the communal open space of a whole lot of asphalt and pretty unsafe areas that don't have any windows looking at them. These are all translucent to maintain privacy. So these, 2 cars can pass, and so you've got a whole area of the development that is kind of dead land that's not used and is pretty unsafe for walking. Would you let the kids play out there? You can't see them because none of the windows look out there, so you can't just poke your head out now and again and make sure everything's okay. So cars and access to car spaces do have huge impacts on design, and we, if we're in a development control assessment role in the statutory planning, we need to be pretty critical about that because that's sort of built into that development now. It's really hard to fix afterwards. Another aspect of design, and in particular of the amenity, is side and rear setbacks. So when I talk about setbacks, I was talking about distance from boundaries, and we had front setbacks, but also there's side setbacks and rear boundary setbacks. So imagine you're in an area, it's suburban, it's got one dwelling on each lot, and then all of a sudden the developer wants to come in and he wants to build right to the boundaries like this. Obviously that's going to have a huge impact on the building next door, where that might be their private open space. And all of a sudden they've got 2 or 3 stories right at their back boundary. In some places that's okay. In Australia, generally in existing suburban areas, ResCode would say not okay because it's too much of an impact on their private open space. So we have a little formula, which I haven't put there, but effectively it comes out as an elevation that looks like that, as the side or rear setback. So it makes a semi-pyramid sort of shape. And generally speaking, it's to decrease the impact. If you were standing here, you wouldn't see a stark wall, but rather you'd see a house that steps back from the boundary, allows a certain amount of light and indeed air, and reduces the visual bulk on the boundary. So this is the kind of thing that you get in all its glories and variations. So you probably wonder, why would something like that be set back? Well, it's because of this part of the design guide. It's been around for nearly 20 years in some form, and it has had a huge influence on all of those houses that have been built, have this little ziggurat approach. Whether or not that's a better outcome overall is sometimes debatable in terms of our urban design, wouldn't you think? Because we end up with these weird shapes as opposed to a structure that sort of has its own integrity. But that's for you to think about. Okay, then we have walls on boundaries. It's a bit like this argument. Should we have big, long walls, 3 metre or 4 metre or 5 metre high walls on boundaries? Generally speaking, 10 metres long plus 25% of the boundary is the maximum. What you find when you have prescriptive standards like this, a developer will build to the absolute maximum almost every single time. It's pretty unusual that they don't. Okay? So essentially it's trying to limit extremely long walls that might modify or impact on amenity. On the other hand, sometimes people might say, actually, I don't mind if you build a big long wall because they want to enclose their garden. Or, more commonly these days, if they say, I don't mind you build a big long wall there, it's because they want to redevelop their own land and they can build up to it without any fear of being told that they're damaging the amenity of next door. So there are some little variations here that you'll see, and if I was a big nasty developer, I'd be certainly putting that to the people next door. Oh, this is good for you because that's your retirement fund. You'll be able to build up to it. Such things. daylight to existing windows. So you can see that we've got lots of trade-offs here, haven't we, between allowing development but trying to maintain existing amenity. So often ResCode is kind of between a rock and a hard place, trying to keep everyone happy, and kind of actually no one's happy because you get a trade-off response. So if we had a big lot, all it has to do is meet. There are minimum setback standards, and there's the basics, and indeed that, I showed that profile. That one applies in the building code. But that's an easy one for builders, the building practitioners to assess because it's just a numeric test. But generally speaking, if people have got a large lot, they don't usually feel the need to push it right up against a boundary anyway. And when they get the building drawings done, they just set it back. So, good point though. So another one about amenity is daylight to existing windows. And it's another example of the kind of compromises that we come up with. So this is an existing structure. It's got a window here. There's a minimum size of distance to the adjoining wall that needs to allow a certain amount of light to that window. And there's a numeric test that sits alongside that as well. So I'm trying not to go into every single detail at this time, but so you can see if you were that person, you probably wouldn't be particularly happy about that. On the other hand, if we made every single window have to have a huge setback, we'd never be allowed to build anything. So it's always this compromise kind of challenge that we face in these questions. North-facing windows have a greater setback, particularly to try and encourage light during winter, so people don't have to turn lights on during the day. Because Melbourne, you know, the sun does get fairly low during the middle of winter, so that setback distance is greater. And then overshadowing. Overshadowing talks about the amount of open space, not buildings, but open space that is overshadowed by a structure. And it's essentially a minimum standard, and it has to be either 75% of existing open space has 5 hours of sunlight to it, or 75%. So choose whichever is the lesser. And if it's less than that to start with, it's not allowed to be compromised. So an example here you can see in plan view. So we're talking about how much a new structure is going to cast a shadow. So that's what we're talking about when we say overshadowing. We normally test that at the equinox, which is in fact 3 days ago. So the equinox day is the same length as night. This one is showing the solstice, the winter solstice, which is the worst case scenario. We sometimes apply this. Some areas require that more extreme test, or it's just there for information. But normally when we're talking about residential development, we use the equinox. Again, a bit of a trade-off because trying to meet a winter solstice overshadowing is an extremely hard test, and as I said before, we'd hardly ever be allowed to build anything. And in fact, usually people's own fences and things overshadow their gardens anyway, or it's windy and rainy. The flip side to that argument is when the sun comes out in the middle of winter, you really want to use it and enjoy it, even if it's, you know, just to get outside for a few minutes. So this is next door to us now. That's College Square, and I acted for Becton in this case. That's not exactly what got built. This is one of the early diagrams, but you can see how far a shadow is cast. And indeed, all you have to do is go to, you know, at this latitude, go to inner city area and see how sunlight just doesn't hit some places for months on end. And there are lots of health impacts and amenity issues. Overlooking is another big one, and this is often where people feel it very personally in their yard, in their living room, etc. So you can see here the test that's being applied is here's a new dwelling. This guy lives next door, and he thinks that he's going to lose amenity here. The test says if there's an area within 9 metres that is someone's private open space, it must be treated with some sort of design response. It could be shutters, it could be changing the nature of the window treatment or so forth to stop that overlooking. Why is it 9 metres? No one really knows. Someone rather cheekily suggested that it was even from the Victorian time where, you know, that was the site, the distance at which a gentleman might not become inflamed if he saw the next door neighbour's wife or something, but I'm not sure about the veracity of those claims, but it was the Victorian era, so who knows. But again, you see here this idea of a trade-off, and you can start to imagine in sort of inner city blocks, if you said it was greater than 9 metres where overlooking would occur, again, you'd never be able to build anything. Yeah, so that's kind of tricky. So, you know, this one was, I visited, this was one of my clients, and I went to them for a completely different planning matter, and they said, oh, let's look at the drawings on the kitchen table, on the dining room table. And I said, whoa, when did that get built? They said, oh, about 3 or 4 years ago. And didn't anyone notice that their balcony is looking into your living room? I said, oh yeah, we weren't too worried about that, but after they started using the balcony, we wish we hadn't said it was okay. Because seriously, when I got there, someone was smoking a cigarette standing out there looking into their living room. But the problem, so they didn't object, you know, they let themselves be convinced it was okay. But what it means, if they want any privacy, they've got to pull that blind down. Now, here's another thing, this is a cultural setting as well. I think, you know, Australians and English and people, we tend to be pretty worried about that. It's not necessarily the case in other places. But the planning scheme and the Act are cultural artefacts, aren't they? They tend to express our general expectations. These were built prior to the Res Code approaches, but these are the sorts of things nowadays we'd really try and avoid. This is something like 6 metres, 6 or 7 metres. You know, balcony looking straight to a living room looking straight to another living room. We generally wouldn't encourage that because you're in these places and you want natural light to come in. You don't necessarily want to see the neighbours sitting down for dinner at the same time eating their meal. Looking into private open space, so this is another development I did some years ago. You know, these guys would have been overlooked. These guys would have been overlooked. And in fact, it was interesting, this was an aged person's kind of, what do you call it? Where they're given care on an ongoing basis. And actually it was determined that these guys weren't too worried about it. Basically, they just never went outside. So, yeah, that's just what it is. Sounds awful, but the gardens were not really used, and they didn't mind. Sometimes, this is a bit of fun, but it's actually also entirely pragmatic, that sometimes you just have to show people what overlooking is like. So I got a surveyor to come and measure where the window would be in the new development that was proposed. Because the neighbours, they didn't mind anything about the new proposal, except they were worried their backyard would be overshadowed by this. So I got the surveyor to come in and to measure exactly where the window would be. I went up, I took some photographs, and I didn't include those photos there, but I took some photographs and I said, you just can't see your backyard because there's trees there, there's another structure, and they're entirely happy and they withdrew their objection. So it's not just this mechanism, but actually demonstrating and showing people, you know, who are not necessarily okay at reading drawings. So there's a lot of ways you can treat overlooking. Some of them are more successful than others. One way you see commonly on drawings is a 1.7 window height. Obviously that doesn't have as big a window, but it is one way of getting ambient light into a room while preventing overlooking. Sometimes you can have all kinds of different louver treatments. Designed nicely, they can actually work quite well. You know, having a box or balcony treatment, etc. Non-transparent glazing, like glass box, that's actually a stairwell behind it. So you get light into the stairs, so you don't have to turn lights on all the time, because you don't really need to see out from the stairs particularly. So there's lots of different ways, and we're trying to encourage innovation so we still get to use land, but we have minimal impacts on the next door neighbours. So trade-offs. There's some other tests about internal views, but also about noise impacts. This particular one is a great example. There are about 30 apartments in here. All of the cars come through this central driveway. Every time they go through, they go bump, 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 and it goes up a slope. So about half of them there seem to have cars with noisy exhausts for whatever reason. Blah, and you could actually hear the windows rattle a little bit, probably because they're fairly low quality windows, as the cars would go up. So, you know, would you want your bedroom there? So that's a pre-res code standard, but I show that just as an example, but that's what we try to design at the design stage and at the site response stage to avoid having that kind of circumstance. And that stuff can manifest in many ways. An automatic door that goes up and down, you know, do you want that next to a bedroom? The swimming pool, you know, where the pump is right next to the next door neighbours, whatever it might be. So try and design that out at the very start rather than having people trying to fix it later. Is the private open space usable? Who gets to use it? Accessibility. I pointed this one out before. This is part of a series that are about on-site amenity. Dwelling entries, trying to make them obvious and at a human scale and make them safe. This one kind of looks like a converted factory, not the most ideal situation. Doesn't add anything to the quality of the streetscape. These are the ones I talked about before, the old six-packs. You know, to get into the apartment, you go down here through some dark bits around a corner and find some stairs where there's very low surveillance. So not very inviting, doesn't add a lot to the street. Relatively older structure there, you know, Californian style, Californian bungalow. You can see where you go in, you know, you can read it in the streetscape. But of course, with newer structures, that's also entirely possible. This is down in Williamstown, that's Elwood, I think. It's probably Elwood as well. So, you know, trying to make things at a human scale, try and make them contribute something to the street in which they're located. Private open space, there's minimum sizes for open space. There's some variations in the new residential zones about that as well. Of course, I won't go into this in full detail here, but you need to know that's one of the big drivers often of how much land can be used. And of course, kind of going back to these core sort of principles, on a large lot in a suburban setting with a single house, it's kind of easy to get good quality open space. As soon as we go to higher densities, it's much more challenged and it has to be carefully designed in various ways. So Res Code seeks to do that. And, you know, to avoid things like this, fairly low amenity, lots of overlooking, lots of concrete, you know, this is what we want to avoid. There's an internal open space test that requires a minimum amount of sunlight to be able to penetrate. So that's a largely numeric test. And just the quality and usability of private open space is also to be tested. We now have a storage per dwelling test. This is an old apartment block, and I found a number of cases where people had nowhere to store things. So it is quite typical now to have a store in the basement, in apartments, and actually I wonder if that standard's wrong, it might be slightly high now, but it's required to be provided. In the first versions of Res Code, there was no requirement for a storage space. So balconies would get filled up with junk, car parks would get filled up with junk, and it was just really made it very difficult for people to live in those smaller structures. And then we go into design and neighbourhood character. Basically, do they fit in? And some of the key things, we've got about 5 minutes and then we'll finish. Does, the facade, how it's articulated, windows and doors, roofs, does it fit in with the area? It doesn't have to mimic, but it has to find some key elements that fit in. So, new structure, but still generally fits in with these, around 1900 structures, because roof design, window proportions, generally fit in with that. It's not a work of art or anything. Workaday, medium density redevelopment, perfectly fine in its setting. Not so sympathetic to the street, lots of dangerous points around here. You can't even find the entrances without poking around. And some attempts occasionally, we've largely stopped this happening now, to use rear lanes as access points with only roller doors, just absolutely terrible. So the newer code sort of stops that from happening too much. Front fences, generally speaking, 1.5 metres is the absolute max. We try very hard to avoid a street that is full of high fences. Security is compromised, streetscape is compromised, and in fact, overall noise is increased, even though people are often doing that to stop traffic noise. The echo canyon effect adds up to way more noise when it's a cumulative effect. And then common property, when we build at higher density, often we get shared space. So walkways, gardens, places for bins. So when we went and looked at this site, we found these bins were getting shifted around because there wasn't a space allocated, and people were constantly running into them with their cars. So they, oh, that's my car spot, get those bloody bins out of the way, because they hadn't been designed into the original design of it to have a space for them to go. And indeed, that was convenient to take out to the street, and that wasn't next to someone's window, so they suffer the smell. Clothes drying, my calculations suggest that would never get sunlight. But it was just jammed there as a place to put it. And you can see all these weeds there. I don't think anyone actually used it. And then subdivision. So that's dealt with in Clause 56. I've talked about that. So, have a look at Clause 56. You won't be tested in detail on this, except the general principles about Clause 56. As I said before, it's about subdivision and the layout of roads. And when we get this opportunity, think of the subdivisions that occur on the edge of a city on a large site. And that's probably the main part of it. So have a look at the new zones, VC 110. They've got some different provisions in them. And here's a question for you. How are buildings over 4 stories dealt with and assessed? Res Code doesn't apply to them. So what applies to those structures? That is a question I would love to hear your answers on. After this, I have a bunch of other things you can look at. I'm flicking through real fast, and for you to think about, and an example of the Windsor Hotel. I won't speak to that, but you can look at that as an example of how you would go through and look at the different zones, etc., on a fairly complex site. I suspect that many people will look at that for the exam rather than trying to look at it now, but there it is. Thanks, guys. Oh, that was a fair bit to get through. Thanks for persevering. Constanza's class, you'll see me because she's unfortunately ill today. See you guys. Thank you.